everyone who organised the meeting, and thanks for everyone who's turned up. What I want to say really is about the economic, unsurprisingly, the economic underpinnings of both privatisation and of getting things back into public ownership, whether that's renationalisation or, as Janine said, some other form of social ownership. Tony Benn, who died earlier this year, said that democracy transferred power from the wallet to the ballot, from the marketplace to the polling station. What people couldn't afford to buy for themselves, they could vote for it. And the best evidence of that is the Attlee government. People couldn't, before the NHS, the welfare state, comprehensive education, a massive expansion of council house building, all of that delivered by Tony Benn's generation of politicians. And it's true, what people couldn't afford for themselves, decent housing, healthcare, schooling, they could vote for it. And that's what democracy does, and we should think about it in those terms. And to be honest, pretty much intact until the late 70s, that consensus remained, that Attlee consensus, I would call it, perpetuated until, and we all know what happened in the late 1970s, and there was a reversal of it. We started a massive programme of privatisation, and we should understand privatisation not purely in ideological terms, though of course a lot of it was ideologically driven, but it was also a huge driver of inequality in this country. Because, and Janine's hinted at this as well, it led to greater exploitation. Not just of the workers, where we know, and I know from my work in PCS, it means, and we all know it, it means a driving down of terms and conditions, cuts in pay, the scrapping of pension schemes. We've seen it across industries, and a worse service to those of us who use it. Rail fares have gone up well above inflation since privatisation, and it's true in all of the utilities as well. So who's benefited from it? The people at the top. People who are the directors who suddenly get 6, 7, 8-figure salaries that certainly weren't paid when it was in public ownership to the bosses. And of course the shareholders who expect a dividend, a return on their capital. So that's how we should see it. I mean, I'll give you an example from PCS Kinetic, which was formerly a part of the Ministry of Defence. It was the Defence Evaluation and Research Agency, which was privatised in 2007. Now, that was privatised by, they said it was a management buyout, and these managers at the top of it and some private investors put in £540,000, and the government just gave them this thing. Within 6 months, stock market flotation, its value had risen 20,000%. Now, I don't know what return you're getting on your bank account. At the moment, my money gets 0.5%, which isn't even keeping up with inflation. So by putting it in the bank, I'm losing money. I don't know what else I could do with it, but it wouldn't gain any more. But, incredible return. In 2009, 2 years after that, they offered their staff a pay freeze. So you can see where the money goes, where the wealth goes when things are privatised. And we should see it as a key driver of inequality in our country. But I hear you say, rhetorically, as a device, he says, that didn't Thatcher promise us this was shareholder democracy, a popular capitalism, everyone would own shares? Nonsense. Absolute nonsense. In 1975, 37.5% of Britain's corporate shares were owned by individuals. By the end of Thatcher's government, when all this stuff had been privatised, 16.5% of the shares of corporate Britain were held by UK individuals. It more than halved. So the idea that this created a mass sharing of wealth by privatising everything is utter nonsense. I probably don't need to convince you of that, but it's good to know the facts of it as well. But privatisation, like I said at the beginning, it was ideological. They did come in to power in 1979 and again in 83 when they really stepped it up, promising to do it. They called it the jewel in the crown of their legislative programme. But it wasn't just ideological. Actually, privatisation is often a sign of economic failure, and I think it's easily forgotten that despite promising a strong, dynamic, stable, efficient economy that Thatcher delivered, that actually she trashed the economy. It was an absolute basket case in the early 80s. If you remember, there was the Saatchi post that said Labour isn't working, and the Tories were outraged that Labour had let unemployment creep just over 1 million, because it hadn't reached that point in the previous 40 years. Within 2 years, they managed to get it to 3 million, which is quite some achievement, given you were elected on the basis of, oh dear, hasn't it got a bit high at 1 million. But it wasn't just unemployment that bore the brunt of it. Economic growth, since this dynamic private sector-led economy, has been lower in the 30 years that followed Thatcher than it was in the 30 years that preceded her. So the idea that the economy has been strengthened by this extra private sector activity and investment in our public services that is contained within it, absolute nonsense. But they did, and it's interesting how short-termist this strategy was, and I will refer to it in my book, but it's first sorry, I will quote from a book, just as an extra plug. But it's mainly, I think you'll understand why I quote from it when I read this out. It's interesting to understand what they actually sold off in the 80s, because the list is colossal. British Petroleum, British Telecommunications, British Gas, Enterprise Oil, the Regional Electricity Boards, the National Grid, Cable and Wireless, British Aerospace, Brit Oil, Amersham International, Ferry Engineering, Ferranti, National Freight, International Air Radio, British Rail Hotels, Gyrobank, British National Oil Corporation, the Regional Water Authorities, British Airways, and of course hundreds of thousands of council homes. That is a colossal list of what was sold off. And Nigel Lawson, who was the longest serving Chancellor, after he'd left power, wrote in his memoirs, proceeds from privatisation, I'm going to put on his voice a bit, and for that matter, council house sales were bound to dry up once all saleable assets had eventually been realised, which was basically saying we flogged off all the best bits and there was nothing left. At the end of Thatcher's period in office, there was a deficit, and privatisation was filling the gap of about a third of that deficit. So far from being more efficient, actually public expenditure was higher under the governments of Thatcher and Major than it was under New Labour as a proportion of GDP, because we had to pay for their economic failure. More people unemployed, less people in work, lower tax revenues, higher welfare expenditure. So, an absolute disaster, and privatisation wasn't just ideological, it was scrabbling about for bits to flog off. And unfortunately it wasn't just Thatcher and Major governments that did this. In 2009, New Labour did the same thing, and Gordon Brown, although he didn't have the chance to implement any of this, but if you look at the last budget, which would have been Alistair Darling's, promised to sell off Royal Mail, now done, the Tote, Royal Mint, Ordnance Survey, the Student Loan Book, and the Channel Tunnel Rail Link. Now that wasn't ideologically driven. I think they were ideologically neutral about it, I think it's fair to say at best, but that was about scrabbling about what can we sell off, the economy's crashed. And that is a sign of economic desperation. It's very short-sighted. Why did they want to sell off those bits? Was it because they could give it to the private sector and it would be run more efficiently and better service for everyone? Or was it that they knew the private sector would find it attractive because you could get a good return out of those bits? Student loans. Students are forced to pay them, you can then charge what interest you like. And that's what they're talking about now, is taking the limits off what you can charge in terms of interest. That's a license to print money. That's basically setting them up as a bank and saying, here are a generation after generation of investors that are going to give you thousands of pounds worth of fees. I could run that. It's not private enterprise. There's no great intellectual thought or great planning needed. So if I move on to public ownership, I think it's interesting because Chuka Umunna, who's the shadow business secretary now, says, we can't pledge to renationalise Royal Mail. We can't pledge to do that because we won't have the money. The money's too tight, but the money won't be there. Now, it's interesting because Clement Attlee's government came into power in 1945 after the Second World War with debt at 245% of our annual economy, 4 times greater than what George Osborne came into power with in 2010. It feels like it's been 1990 something that he came in 2010. And yet they nationalised coal, steel, rail, road haulage, civil aviation, and a whole host of other things. How did they do it? They said, we're having it, here's some treasury bonds that gave a return to those people who had the shares. Very simple. Now, you could do it, I think, at the price that the people who have benefited from most told us it was worth in the first place, rather than the share price that it will now be. I think that's fair, because why should we pay for the grand larceny of what's happened? I'm sure Maria will go into that in greater depth. So it doesn't cost anything to renationalise. It's not just the railways you can do with the franchises. You can do it exactly the same way that Attlee's government managed it in a far worse economic situation, it should be said. But I think there's a simple test of what should be in public ownership. Just ideologically, it should be in public ownership. And that's if it's too important to fail. Because as Janine pointed out, when the East Coast Rail line was, National Express basically handed the keys back and said, we've mismanaged it, please take it off our hands. The government couldn't throw its hands up in the air and say, well, that's the market. We just won't have any rail services then, because it's not a true market, it's too important to fail. Just as the government couldn't let the banks crash, because it held our wages, our pensions, our mortgages, it's too important to fail. And so if something's too important to fail, it shouldn't be left to the private sector to run it. They're not responsible enough, that's the thing. And in my book, I give a couple of other ideas, which I think build on the ideas that Janine said. I think people, because we don't talk about economic rights, and I think people need economic rights. And two that I'd point out would be, I think any worker, or workers collectively, should have the right to cooperativise their company. Simple thing. The majority of workers say, you know what, we want to get rid of our management, our bosses, we want to run it as a cooperative. Simple majority vote, it's theirs. Co-op, done. Doesn't matter if it's profitable, not, in trouble, no, we don't want the lame ducks, we'll have the white swans, thank you very much, as well. Why not? Why not? And you can work out forms of compensation that could involve treasury bonds, but also there's another thing, the right to buy out. You know, at the moment we've got the AstraZeneca deal, and I see I've been given a Pfizer pen here, actually. I'm not sure what pin that was trying to make, but I am not sponsored by any pharmaceutical giant, I can assure you. But why should it be that actually workers don't have the first right to say, you know what, we're buying out? If they've got funding collectively through their trade union or any other route, that very modest thing, but why not? I think the right to cooperativise is far more radical and a lot better, but you know, let's ease the way into it, because we're a long way from that sin. So I think we need to understand why privatisation happens, and also think about what sort of public ownership we want, but also what economic rights accompany that as well, for us and for people who want to bring things into various forms of social ownership. So I'll end there, and hopefully that's a few things to generate a debate later.
Thanks very much, Andrew, and I